8,000 years ago, along the banks of the Nile, a man struggles for existence. His very survival depends on his ability to overcome the natural habitat and secure his next meal. But he is not the only hunter that prowls these green shores. There are many dangers, and he poses no threat to them. The earth belongs to the strong. The great hippopotamus, the most dangerous animal in the Nile. He will find himself gored to death if he is seen. Humankind is not the master here. He is a guest at nature's bidding. He must obey the rules, eat or be eaten. That is the way of the wild. Time will pass though, and he will learn. And then, not even Mother Nature herself could foresee what this primate will eventually become. This hunter-gatherer does not know it, but he is the ancestor of one of the most sophisticated civilizations in his species' history, and his descendants will largely abandon his careful techniques, honed over generations for survival. His descendants will instead inherit a very different world, and reshape it beyond his wildest imagination. This is the story of Egypt, unlocked through the power of Assassin's Creed Origins Discovery Tour. The story of an agricultural superpower birthed in the desert. A tale with its beginnings in the dawn of human history, and its endings shrouded in the mists of time. In this episode, we'll explore the foundation of this ancient land, by first looking at the reason why it even existed. The great river Nile, upon whose banks the Egyptians clung. The Nile River, the longest river in the world, stretching over 6,500 kilometers from source to sea, starts its journey here, in these two regions. The Great Lakes region of East Africa and the Ethiopian highlands. The Nile is made up of two main tributaries, the White Nile and the Blue Nile, which come together to form the Nile River here, where the city of Khartoum is today located. The Nile continues to flow south to north, winding its way across the Sahara Desert. It's worth taking a moment to point out this anomaly here. This is the Aswan High Dam, forming Lake Nasser. It was built in the 1960s though, and was not around during the time of the ancient Egyptians. Beyond the dam, the Nile gets gradually broader and slower before it finally fans out into the broad Nile Delta and flows into the Mediterranean Sea. Geographically, the Nile is a fascinating landscape, but for early humans in the region, it was a vital life support system as climate change changed the world around them. The Nile has been the site of human settlement for around 10,000 years, give or take. The first humans were the hunter-gatherers we've already met. They lived off the bounty of the Nile, eating fish, birds, animals, and a variety of plants and fruits. The river provided for much of their needs, as food was naturally abundant. As the last ice age ended some 15,000 years ago, the previously lush green Sahara gradually dried, pushing the hunter-gatherers into enclaves of survival. The growing desert pushed them into the green band of the Nile. The Nile was an interesting neighbor to have, though. She wasn't just a constant. She wasn't just full of food. The Nile was also home to dangerous predators. Her shape depth, and width also changed throughout the year. Her waters rose and then fell again. Early humans on the Nile's banks noted all of these changes in their mother river, and soon they developed stories to explain them. The stories were passed down and molded into beliefs. We start seeing the beginnings of what will eventually become the rich pantheon of the Egyptian gods. But the secret of the Nile had yet to be unlocked by these early proto-Egyptians. After 1,000 years of living off her bounty, they hadn't discovered how she could propel their society into the future. For that to happen, the newly discovered method of food accumulation would first need to make its way to Egypt. Yes, farming. Now, what we call the agricultural revolution refers to when humankind began growing their own food rather than catching it. That's a bit of an oversimplification to say that humans shifted over from one to the other immediately, but that is beyond the scope here. All we need to understand is that farming became a thing. We're not sure exactly when farming began in Egypt, but the earliest evidence points to around 7,000 years ago, or around 5,200 BCE. Farming had already kicked off in Mesopotamia, and it's likely it filtered into Egypt along trade routes, always brought by wandering farmers looking for fertile land to farm. Back in Mesopotamia, farming was developed along two massive fertile rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Well, guess what? The Nile is also a massive fertile river. But the Nile has a trick up its sleeve. I've already mentioned that the Nile flooded. These floods happened every year at around the same time, so they were predictable. They could be expected, so they could be planned for. But first, why did the Nile flood? Now remember the Ethiopian highlands and the Great Lakes region where the Nile rises? Well, heavy rainfall and melting snow in the highlands caused a massive influx of water down the White and Blue Niles, causing floods downstream. But what was most useful about this phenomenon was that it also resulted in the transportation of sediments and silt with the rushing waters. The increased water would cause the Nile to flood and deposit the sediment and silt on the banks as it overflowed. The waters would recede after a few weeks, but they would leave behind this rich black silt, and straight into that could be planted crops. We could say that farming as an idea found fertile ground in Egypt. The fact that it happened every year at the same time meant farmers could plan to plant, tend, reap, sow, and then store until such time as they could plant the next crop. Early Egyptian farmers primarily grew grains, such as wheat and barley, but also a great deal of fruits and seeds to complement their diet, which were primarily vegetarian, with a small amount of meat and fish every now and again. Domestic animals like sheep, cattle, and goats also made their way into Egypt. Farming forced these previously nomadic hunter-gatherers to settle into villages to tend to their crops and animals. More food meant more children, and the population boomed. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities. Cities expanded their power and controlled territories as chiefdoms. These chiefdoms fought, conquered, and grew into kingdoms. Egypt had left the Neolithic era of hunter-gatherers and entered the pre-dynastic period of unified kingdoms along the Nile of settled agriculturalists. Farming had broken the dawn of human civilization in Egypt. But there's also more to it. The Nile acted like a highway as well. Boats could sail up and down the river very easily, and frequently did. They carried food and goods to be traded, messengers between families. But they also carried some unintended cargo. These traveling traders also carried news with them from far corners of the Nile. They also carried stories about how the world came to be. They spoke a language that could be shared. So the Nile just didn't facilitate the movement of goods, but also the movement of cultural ideas, the movement of language, and the creation of a shared identity. Over time, all those previously ununified cities and kingdoms along the Nile would start to share an understanding of the world. They would start to share an identity born out of a shared system of beliefs and languages. All it would take to unify the land into a single kingdom was a powerful enough ruler to eventually unite them. A story for another time. So then, the Nile was an important food source, transport route, and engine for cultural unity, right? Wrong. It was still so much more than that to the Egyptians. I've mentioned how they started to notice how the river shifted and changed, how the river flooded. and how the Egyptians made stories about how and why. But let me tell you now how the Nile also formed the very fabric of the universe. It would be safe to say that most modern interpretations of the world are defined by two opposing forces, good versus evil, often personified by supernatural beings that battle for the fate of humanity. The most easily recognizable in the West is obviously found in Christianity, the eternal struggle between the Christian God and his opposite number Lucifer or Satan. Even our popular culture is influenced along these lines, such as in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings or J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter books. For Egyptians, though, their world was not defined by good or evil, or at least not by the way we could interpret it. Instead, their world was defined by the eternal battle between the forces of order and the forces of chaos. These forces weren't in a battle for human souls, rather for dominion of Geb, the name the Egyptians gave to the earth. Let's stand here for a moment, on the border between the two forces that the Egyptians contended with on the daily. There lies the desert. Dead, dry, desolate, a death sentence for the unprepared. Here lies the Nile, lush, green, the foundation of life in the region. Which is order, and which is chaos? Of course, the desert is chaos, and the Nile is order. It's a fairly simple distinction. But this game saves data, I hear you ask. Isn't it basically good and evil? Come on, man. That's no different. But it is, I would say back to you. You see, although order was preferable to chaos, chaos had its uses to Egyptians. The chaotic desert protected Egypt's borders. It could be used to get revenge on a neighbor or criminal. It wasn't inherently evil. It was much more nuanced than a simple black and white distinction between what was good and what was evil. We won't get into this too much here. That's a later video. But basically the Nile was so important to Egyptians that it's what they constructed their entire worldview on. Imagine living in this land at the mercy of the two forces of order and chaos, either of which could mean your life or death. The desert could swallow up the Nile if the waters dried up and you along with it. So you see, this was much more important and logical for Egyptians than the ideas of good and evil. They simply weren't that important as concepts. In summary, the river also represented the primary explanation for the nature of the world. The floods were divinely inspired, the epitome of order. Food and life were sustained by order. And so order must be the way that gods intended life to be. But woe to those who neglected to respect chaos, for bad things may befall them in the dark. But now, let's sail down the river and review what we've covered. So, the Nile was initially populated by early hunter-gatherers during the Neolithic period. Farming arrived in Egypt around 5200 BCE and created settled farming communities along her banks, giving rise to the pre-dynastic period. Yearly floods called the inundation created fertile farming lands on the floodplains, resulting in huge quantities of food being grown, resulting in a population boom on the Nile. The growing population led to a growth in towns and cities who expanded their rule over vast areas of the Nile. Easy transportation knitted these cities together as language, culture, and beliefs spread easily up and down the river, creating a unified identity. These beliefs were based upon the Nile's movements and were defined by the struggle of order versus chaos. So that's that. The Nile, the absolute starting point of ancient Egypt. We have to start here, to end where we will. We have to understand why the Nile was so important to Egyptians before we can even start looking at the Egyptians themselves. And trust me, there's a whole lot more left to discover. Stick around and find out. I hope this video has laid a solid enough foundation for the further development of the features of ancient Egypt we will cover going forward, and I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please do like and comment below. It does help raise the profile of the channel. It also helps if you subscribe and turn on the bell icon so that you receive notifications for our Discovery series. Until the next time, this has been This Game Saves Data, using Assassin's Creed Origins Discovery tool. Links to the game can be found below in the description if you're interested in picking it up for yourself. Until the next time, thank you very much and goodbye.